Ha! I knew it! Gremlins is classified as a horror film. That's all I needed to hear. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Home Drive-In. Keep it out of the light, don't get it wet, and never feed it after midnight. 3 simple rules, clearly made to be broken, are now a part of cinema legend. While it is a bit late to be covering a Christmas movie, I found it hard to resist diving into Joe Dante's supposed family-friendly and surprise hit horror comedy, Gremlins. As always, I will be discussing the movie in depth, so if by some chance you haven't seen this Spielberg-produced monster mash, please consider this your spoiler warning moving forward. And if you are new to this channel, please give this video a like and consider hitting those subscribe and notification buttons. But for now, let the show begin. Gremlins tells the story of a young man who receives a unique Christmas gift from his inventor father, an adorable, furry and intelligent little creature known as a Mogwai. However, this cute little critter comes with 3 very important stipulations, which, when ultimately broken, spawns legions of devilish little monsters that terrorize the otherwise picture-perfect town of Kingston Falls. Writer Chris Columbus, yes, the one who would later direct the first 2 Harry Potter films, wrote the script for Gremlins at film school, only ever intending the project to be a writing sample. Columbus came up with the idea while living in a rather unpleasant loft, where he would hear and occasionally feel mice scurrying around him, igniting his fear of all things small and potentially dangerous. Columbus' script was originally a much darker story, with moments including the decapitation of Billy's mother and the Gremlins even making a meal of the family dog. Gizmo was also never originally going to survive past the halfway mark of the film, as it was originally conceived that he would be the one to evolve into lead Gremlin Stripe. Steven Spielberg co-funded his production company Amblin Entertainment in 1981 and purchased the script after recognizing the increasing popularity of horror comedy. Taking the role of executive producer, Spielberg insisted, however, on toning down the violence, to keep the film a little more family-friendly. Another major alteration was keeping the character of Gizmo alive throughout the film, to be a loyal sidekick to protagonist Billy. And we're all indebted to Mr. Spielberg for that incredibly wise decision. Considering that the creatures were all intended to be by nature evil, Columbus discovered the term Mogwai after looking up the Chinese term for the word devil. The term Gremlins had already entered the public subconscious, becoming something of folklore among World War II pilots who would blame Gremlins for causing malfunctions with their aircraft. Roald Dahl even published a book in 1943 entitled The Gremlins, where the mysterious creatures would sabotage Royal Navy planes in retribution for the destruction of their forest homes. The premise then evolved into the Twilight Zone episode Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which would later be remade in the 1983 film Twilight Zone: The Movie. Director Joe Dante was experiencing a slight sag in his career, yet Spielberg selected him for Gremlins due to the success of his darkly comedic films Piranha and The Howling. Spielberg felt that the premise of Gremlins would remain somewhat believable if they cast unknown actors, allowing the audience to focus on characters rather than be distracted by celebrities. Zach Galligan, who had played the lead role in the as-yet unreleased film Nothing Lasts Forever, was cast as Billy Peltzer, the film's main protagonist and recipient of Gizmo. Phoebe Cates was the first and only choice to play Billy's love interest Kate, whose casting did raise a few eyebrows due to her rather risque appearance in Fast Times at Ridgemont High with Gremlins co-star Judge Reinhold. Due to the tight-lipped nature of the project, Galligan and Cates were only handed the scene in which Billy walks Kate home, leading Galligan to believe he was about to audition for a teen romance. However, it wasn't the audition itself that won them their roles, but a rather tender moment that occurred between them afterwards. Galligan jokingly put his head on Kate's shoulder, making an off-the-cuff remark about young love, a moment that immediately caught the eye of Steven Spielberg. Upon witnessing this moment, Spielberg immediately remarked that they looked great together, quipping that Galligan was already in love. Actor and musician Hoyt Axton was the first choice to play Billy's father Randall, largely due to his performance in The Black Stallion. Frances Lee McCain, who would appear in Footloose the same year, plays Billy's mother Lynn, while Polly Holliday appears as the town's mean-spirited real estate mogul, Mrs. Deagle. Frequent Joe Dante collaborator Dick Miller also gives a memorable performance as the town's somewhat xenophobic World War II veteran, Mr. Futterman. Veteran actor and artist Key Luke bookends the film with his role as the Mogwai's original owner, Mr. Wing, while John Louis features as Mr. Wing's grandson. John Louis should go on record as being the first actor to utter the 3 golden Mogwai rules, and also seemed very keen for this film to come out as soon as possible.
The picture will be out in a year.
A year?
Oh, about a year.
Can't bring it out on Christmas?
No, I can't bring it out at Christmas.
And on the topic of child stars, Corey Feldman, who was featured in Friday the 13th, the final chapter the same year, appears as Billy's friend Pete. Glenn Turman features as the schoolteacher Mr. Hanson, and Jackie Joseph, who played Audrey in the original Little Shop of Horrors, has a brief appearance as Mrs. Futterman. Veteran actor Scott Brady plays Sheriff Frank, and before he was Mike from Breaking Bad, Jonathan Banks features as Deputy Brent. Yet with such an ensemble human cast, Joe Dante has gone on record to say that one particular actor would stand tall. And I use that term loosely. Billy's lovable dog Barney was expertly played by Mushroom, chosen for his expressive nature and conviction that the Mogwai puppet was actually real. And while the titular Gremlins and their cuddly counterparts were all portrayed by expertly crafted visual effects and puppetry, their voices are provided by some very real human beings.
Actually, this is my real voice.
I do this so people don't make fun of me.
Comedian Howie Mandel, who at this point was best known for his recurring role in Sent Elsewhere, provided the voice for Gizmo most of the time. For moments when Gizmo is singing his famous theme song, the voice heard is actually a young girl named Eileen Keyes, who is one of composer Jerry Goldsmith's choir singers. A number of vocal talents provided the voice for the various other Mogwai and Gremlins, including Frank Welker, who voiced Stripe, and Police Academy sound effects funny man Michael Winslow. On a budget of $11 million, the filming of Gremlins was divided into 2 parts, with principal photography beginning in April 1983, lasting approximately 3 months. Production then shut down for a few weeks while the effects department prepared to film numerous shots dedicated solely to the Gremlin puppets, adding a further 10 grueling weeks to the schedule. Gremlins was filmed primarily at Warner Bros. Studios Burbank, as well as the Universal backlot, all of which helped to create the fictional town of Kingston Falls. Despite Joe Dante's fondness for location shooting, the choice to film on these respective backlots was a very deliberate one. By intentionally making Kingston Falls appear as picturesque as possible, the production team felt that this gave the film a stylized look for the rather wacky concept to exist in. Although the final movie was intended to be light-hearted and fun, the production process for Gremlins proved to be a grueling challenge for the cast and crew. Being set during Christmas, the production team made a difficult shoot even harder by filming during the spring and summer. The cast was required to rug up in winter woolies during some incredibly warm weather, with the crew often needing to remind them that they had to act cold. Nonetheless, Joe Dante maintained a relaxed attitude with his cast, especially Hoyt Axton, whose naturalistic acting style allowed him to improvise much of his dialogue. The idea of making his character a less than successful inventor was to align with previous folklore about gremlins causing things to fall apart, which does result in some hilarious moments. And of course, this affiliation with technology and gadgetry would inspire the name Gizmo. Mushroom the dog, whose one mistake on set was accidentally ripping off Gizmo's ear, was nicknamed the All-Purpose Cutaway. As such, many moments feature some expressive shots from the canine star, who also had an uncanny ability to time his reactions with the Gizmo puppet, which Joe Dante would call pure serendipity. Zach Galligan was permitted some time to bond with his canine co-star, especially since they would need to be united against a common enemy.
Barney, you get him out of the house, my dear lady.
Despite playing the film's secondary villain, Mrs. Deagle actress Polly Holliday was by all accounts a very sweet-natured individual. In fact, one scene in which she fondly reminisces over a picture of her dead husband had to be removed since the producers didn't want the audience to sympathise with her character. Incidentally, the photo in question was actually of the late actor Edward Arnold, also seen hanging on the wall when Mrs. Deagle makes her grand exit from the film. To establish Mrs. Deagle as the money-hungry real estate mogul that she is, it was decided that her collection of household cats would be named after various forms of currency. including the names
Kopeck. Dollar bill.
And while not actually mentioned on screen, by all accounts this dish belongs to a kitty cat named Drachma. Phoebe Cates had her own hypothesis as to why Joe Dante allowed his cast so much freedom, theorising that Gremlins was never going to focus on the human characters. Chris Walas, who worked on some of the creature effects for Return of the Jedi and also gave us the melting Nazi in Raiders of the Lost Ark, was brought in to create the creature effects for Gremlins. In a pre-production process lasting about 7 months, Walas assembled a team of artists and puppeteers, many of which who had not worked on a feature film before. While an ambitious Joe Dante suggested that they primarily use stop-motion animation, Chris Walas quickly brought him back down to earth, stating that puppetry was the way to go. And we're all indebted to Chris Walas for that incredibly wise decision. Many of the studio sets had to be constructed several feet off the ground to allow the effects team to puppeteer the gremlin animatronics from below the floor. The puppeteers virtually lived beneath the sets for weeks on end, requiring the use of television monitors to see what was happening above. The amount of puppets created was jaw-dropping, with around a dozen created for Gizmo alone, as well as an incredibly detailed, scaled-up version for his more expressive close-ups. Based primarily on Atasia, Steven Spielberg provided his own input for the look of Gizmo, requesting that his fur be the same colour as his beloved King Charles Cavalier Spaniels. Since he was featured so prominently, working with the Gizmo puppets wound up causing massive headaches for the effects department. And since they grew to hate him so much, the crew made a point of devising certain scenes where the Gremlins would torment poor Gizmo as much as possible. To illustrate Gizmo's complexity, a couple of scenes where Billy picks him up and places him down on a table require the use of two very different animatronics. While holding him, the prop is a simple radio-controlled puppet with limited movements, yet when he places him on a table, Zach Galligan is in fact handing the puppet to an off-screen crew member. The camera then pans down to reveal another, more intricate puppet preset on the table, with wires fed through a hole underneath to operate the now seated Mogwai. A similar technique was used when Gizmo begins to multiply, which also made use of some clever under-the-table magic. The shots of the new Mogwai evolving were achieved with simple latex balloons covered in fur that were slowly being inflated from underneath the table. The reveal of the Mogwai was intentionally drawn out as long as possible, mostly to build suspense, yet also since the character was still in development when principal photography began. The producers were a little nervous about Gizmo's first reveal, yet audiences ultimately gave the intended response. Aww. Audiences also gave some firm applause when getting their first look at Gizmo's far less adorable offspring. According to Chris Walas, hundreds of Gremlin animatronics were produced, including 14 dedicated solely to lead Gremlin Stripe, many of which required up to 12 people to operate. And while the majority of creature effects were achieved in camera, there was some post-production wizardry used to make the massive amount of Gremlin puppets appear even larger. The extreme wide-angle shots of the Gremlins watching Snow White were actually filmed in sections, using the same puppets over and over and then finally combined in post-production. Since puppetry was key in bringing the Gremlins to life, the effects hold up incredibly well, at least for scenes in which the Gremlins are seen from the waist up. Making the Gremlins walk, however, proved to be a far more challenging endeavour. The few shots in which the Gremlins can be seen walking were achieved using marionettes, however the effects team wasn't all that happy with the results, hence why it was used sparingly. Yet such an effect wasn't going to work for the shot following Stripe's dip in the local pool, where he and a horde of his newly sprouted offspring are first seen walking the streets. Instead, this shot was indeed created using stop-motion animation, taking several weeks to complete. However, the process may have taken much longer had it not been for the ingenuity of the director. During the painstaking frame-by-frame animation process, one of the model's streetlights actually blew out, with the effects team worried they would have to start the process over again. However, Joe Dante insisted they just continue with the shot as is, later adding the sound of glass shattering to make it look like the Gremlins destroyed the lamp themselves. While the second lot of filming occurred after the majority of the cast had already wrapped, the production team was not quite finished with Phoebe Cates. Her scene with a crowd of drunken and rowdy gremlins was filmed in the later stage of production over a 3-day period, with allegedly a very little cleanup happening in between. As a result, one day on set, Phoebe Cates surprised the crew with a thoroughly convincing and ear-piercing scream. However, it turns out she wasn't exactly acting. The young actress had been startled by the sight of a massive cockroach that arrived on set, clearly attracted by the odour of stale beer and pretzels. However, Miss Cates' true moment to shine came with a very controversial scene that most producers were adamant would never make the final cut.
It was Christmas Eve. I was 9 years old.
Amid the creature chaos happening around them, our leading characters stop to rest when Kate delivers a 55-second monologue to Billy telling a story about her father's death. Everyone from Spielberg to the cast and even the film's editor was certain that this scene would never be included, due to its darkly absurd premise and the undeniably earnest delivery from Phoebe Cates. However, Chris Columbus and Joe Dante fought to have the moment retained, convinced that the scene perfectly encapsulated the film's quirky combination of horror and humour. Recognising that this was Joe Dante's film, Spielberg used his influence to let him keep the scene intact, despite producers and audiences alike viewing the moment as some kind of sick joke. Dante, however, would go on to parody his beloved scene in the sequel, where Kate begins to retell another tragic story, only to have Billy usher her away before she can finish.
This man with this
Honey,
beard and a hat looked just like Abe Lincoln.
Honey, I really don't think
Except
we've
for
got
the
time for
raincoat.
this now, you know?
With actor Zach Galligan clearly unable to hide his amusement. The combination of Steven Spielberg and Joe Dante inevitably inspired several film references throughout Gremlins to entice fans of both sci-fi and horror. Dante threw in a couple of nods to his own work, paying tribute to his campy horror film Piranha, with a sketch of one of the carnivorous fish visible when Billy first brings the mogwai to Dr. Hansen. Not able to feature Kevin McCarthy as he had done in many of his previous films, Dante did manage to work the actor in when Billy and Gizmo watched the 1956 Invasion of the Body Snatchers on TV. There are some brief cameos scattered throughout the film with the likes of animation legend Chuck Jones and Kenneth Tobey, who appeared in The Thing from Another World. However, film buffs will no doubt lap up the scene at the Inventors Convention where Randall Peltzer is talking to his wife on the phone, with more references that you could shake a bathroom buddy at. The titular time machine from the original 1960s film can be seen briefly in the background, only to mysteriously vanish in a later shot. Composer Jerry Goldsmith also appears outside the phone booth, yet the most prominent cameo comes in the form of Robbie the Robot from the 1950s classic Forbidden Planet. Spielberg himself can also be glimpsed riding in a scooter in the foreground with his leg in a cast due to a previous accident the director endured. And the master storyteller himself couldn't resist including a few of his own references. When Billy is walking to work, he passes a cinema advertising the films Watch the Skies and A Boy's Life, which were the working titles for Close Encounters of the Third Kind and E.T. respectively. And speaking of which, a toy of everyone's favourite long-distance phone caller can be seen during the film's penultimate showdown in the department store. The department store finale did undergo one minor change when Spielberg insisted that Gizmo, not Billy, should emerge as the ultimate hero. Originally, Billy and Gizmo were each going to draw back a blind to expose sole Gremlin survivor Stripe to the morning sunlight, in a scene Zach Galligan insisted was indeed filmed. However, upon viewing the final result, Zach Galligan confronted Joe Dante about the change, who retorted, "The movie is called Gremlins, not Billy's Adventures in Kingston Falls."
Did you see? They got Mr. Corbin. They almost got me, but I outsmarted them.
While Phoebe Cates' aforementioned monologue did make the final cut, several scenes didn't, some of which may have helped fill in some of the film's more obscure moments.
It isn't Captain Clip-On.
When Gerald, played by Judge Reinhold, approaches Billy at Dory's Tavern, he refers to him as Captain Clip-On, which is a callback to an earlier, deleted scene that took place at the bank where they both work. The scene involves Billy being berated by his boss for his lateness, which concludes with him making an off-the-cuff remark about his clip-on tie.
Although we do not have an automated teller as yet, I dare say that when we do, it will not wear a clip-on tie.
It appears that the film was trying to introduce Gerald as somewhat of a romantic rival for Billy and Kate, yet after this moment the character is never seen again. However, in a later deleted scene, Kate and Billy discover Mrs. Deagle's plans to develop a chemical plant in Kingston Falls, yet are caught by Gerald, who then attempts to blackmail Kate into dating him. Later in the film, after Kate tells her tragic story, the scene was originally going to reveal that Gerald had locked himself in the bank vault, having seemingly lost his mind following the Gremlin mayhem.
Christmas carolers.
When we see Mrs. Deagle mumbling about the singing outside her home, this was originally going to lead into a scene where she wards off some human carolers at her doorstep. This is why in the final cut, when she confronts the Gremlins, she can be heard yelling, "I warned you, brats," in response to the earlier deleted moment.
I warned you, brats!
After a busy couple of years writing the themes for the likes of First Blood, Supergirl and Poltergeist, Jerry Goldsmith was brought in to deliver the score for Gremlins. However, when first hearing the now iconic ragtime main theme that Goldsmith had written, Joe Dante was not 100% sold, yet came around saying, "It's Jerry Goldsmith, he knows what he's doing." The resulting score certainly proved that he did, being an energetic, bizarre, humorous and undeniably memorable selection of largely synthetic tunes, perfectly encapsulating the film's darkly comedic tone. The soundtrack for Gremlins took its time getting the release it deserved, with a mini-album by Geffen Records released in 1984. The album contained less than 20 minutes of Goldsmith's music, which was sidelined to the B-side, with 3 songs used in the film taking up side A of the album, for a grand total of 7 tracks. However, in 2011, Film Score Records, under their Retrograde label, released the complete score on 2 discs, totaling 34 tracks, with the original Geffen's 7-track release as a bonus on the second disc. Mondo Records also released a 25-track edition on vinyl in 2016, which sports some pretty nifty artwork. Fans of Jerry Goldsmith and Gremlins will definitely want to add this to their collection, with many of the themes igniting some truly nostalgic feelings, especially if, like me, you grew up watching this film.
Billy Pelser has a nice home.
Billy, is that you?
Yeah, Mom, it's me.
Gremlins hit cinemas in the US on June 8, 1984, in direct competition with what would be another major blockbuster, also released the very same day. While Ghostbusters was the biggest success overall, according to many reports, Gremlins did much better in its opening week in New York City for one very understandable reason. Since Ghostbusters required the shutdown of many major streets to complete filming, it appears that New Yorkers were a little disgruntled at the disruptions to their beloved city. Therefore, with their noses out of joint, the Big Apple seemed to boycott Ghostbusters and flock to Gremlins instead. Gremlins brought in approximately $165 million worldwide on its comparatively small $11 million budget, becoming a massive box office success. The film earned generally favourable reviews, receiving Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel's approval. However, Gremlins was not without its detractors. Leonard Maltin was less than impressed, labelling Gremlins as icky and gross, while criticising the film's all too vivid depictions of violence. However, being good friends with Joe Dante, Maltin was invited back 5 years later to appear in Gremlins 2, where the critters could seek retribution for his comments on their first adventure. However, Leonard Maltin was not Gremlins' most vocal critic, with some parents appalled by the film's violence in the guise of a supposed family-friendly film. It did appear that the film's marketing had convinced parents, especially in light of Steven Spielberg's involvement, that they were walking in to see another E.T. Of particular scrutiny was the scene with Frances Lee McCain going full Sarah Connor on a trio of gremlins in her kitchen, with a beheading, violent stabbing, death by blender, and movie history's most memorable microwave scene. And don't you just love that ding at the end? While Gremlins pushed the boundaries of what was suitable for children, it appears parents were particularly upset over this scene, which Joe Dante calls a defining moment in the film. Parents were also a little upset by this little revelation by Phoebe Cates.
And that's how I found out there was no Santa Claus.
However, Gremlins was not the only Spielberg film of 1984 to get parents up in arms. With Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom and Gremlins both coming under fire, the director jumped into action and approached the MPAA with a small suggestion. Spielberg proposed that there needed to be another rating to nest in between the family-approved PG and the adult-targeted R rating. Hence, in July of 1984, the PG-13 rating was born, with the war thriller Red Dawn being the first film to be branded with the classification. Parental concerns aside, Gremlins was still a success, yet the film itself was only the tip of the iceberg, as when producers got their first look at Gizmo, it was clear they had something else on their minds.
Dolls with suction cups staring out car windows.
In a trend set firmly by the massive merchandising of Star Wars and E.T., several Gremlins toys, dolls, figurines, and even an Atari video game had parents parting with their hard-earned cash. Yet in 1998, according to Variety magazine, Warner Bros. Filed a lawsuit against toy company Hasbro, following the release of their original Furby plush toy, which bore more than a close resemblance to Gizmo. The lawsuit was apparently settled out of court for an undisclosed seven-figure sum, on the stipulation that the toy underwent some redesigning. A novel tie-in by George Guype was also published that offers a prologue backstory about the Mogwai's origins, and while I can't spoil anything since I haven't read it, it does apparently involve aliens. The novel also contains subplots that were mostly removed from the film, including Mrs. Deagle's plans to sell off parts of Kingston Falls to a chemical company. And with pop culture merchandise now exploding in these modern times, Gremlins products have made a resurgence, so kids and adults alike can once again purchase their very own Mogwai. Just, remember the rules. And if the film and merchandising didn't quite fill everyone's subconscious with gremlin fever, it seemed Gizmo and his crew were also finding their way into public service adverts.
Rule number 2, never let them get into a car with a driver who has been drinking.
The demand for a sequel to Gremlins began almost immediately, with Warner Bros. Asking if Joe Dante would be up for round 2. However, exhausted by his experience on the first film, he initially declined, until it was brought up again a few years later when the studio made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Which was, if you make a sequel, you can do anything you want. Dante finally agreed, and a sequel was released in 1990, which clearly demonstrated that he'd taken the offer of do anything you want quite seriously.
Start spreading the news. I'm leaving today.
This time set in New York City, Gremlins 2, The New Batch, was a far more ambitious, light-hearted and satirical take on corporate America, the original Gremlins, and the film industry itself. However, 6 years after the original, it seemed that audiences had moved on, with Gremlins 2 taking in only $41 million back from its $50 million budget. However, many critics and audience members, including director Joe Dante himself, have gone on record to state they actually prefer the sequel to the original. So
check it out one time, won't you?
The franchise made a resurgence in 2023 when streaming service Max debuted the prequel animated TV series Gremlins: Secrets of the Mogwai, which takes place in 1920s Shanghai. The series concerns the adventures of Sam Wing, the shop owner from the original Gremlins as a child, who meets Gizmo for the first time. A second season premiered in October 2024, with both seasons so far met with positive reviews, with some critics saying it manages to capture the enjoyable mayhem of the original films. There has been talk of a Gremlins 3 as early as 2011, with Chris Columbus allegedly keen to proceed with a completed script ready to go. Actor Zach Galligan states he has been asked countless times about the possibility of a third film, expressing he would be eager to return to the series. He sees the animated show as a great way to introduce the franchise to younger audiences, and if it does for Gremlins what The Mandalorian did for Star Wars, he thinks Gremlins 3 is likely inevitable. In the meantime, we can settle for Zach Galligan and Gizmo's Mountain Dew commercial to tide us over. And since I brought up The Mandalorian, Zach Galligan insists that no matter how cute Baby Yoda is, Gizmo will always be cuter. The film was released on Blu-ray in 2009 by Warner Brothers, featuring 2 commentaries with several casting crew, including Joe Dante, Zach Galligan, Phoebe Cates, and effects designer Chris Wallace. The release also features 10 minutes of deleted scenes with optional commentaries and a 6-minute archival documentary about the making of the film. In 2014, the 30th anniversary Diamond Deluxe edition was released with additional extras, including 2 documentaries with new interviews and behind-the-scenes footage. Gremlins was released in 4K in 2019, which according to Blu-ray.com was going to come with some brand new special features, which Warner Brothers apparently dropped at the last minute. Nonetheless, the 4K Blu-ray does come with the same special features found in the 2009 release and reportedly contains an improved picture quality than found on previous releases. Having begged my mother to take me to see Gremlins more than once as a child, and their countless rewatches on VHS, it's fair to say that my nostalgia for this film overshadows any flaws it might have. The film might not quite entice its modern target audience the way it did in the 1980s, but it remains in the public consciousness with its iconic premise, likeable characters, and quirky tone. Gremlins has aged remarkably well, greatly benefiting from the pre-existence of CGI with some amazing practical effects work and puppetry. As a relatively family-friendly horror comedy, Gremlins won't quench the thirst of hardcore horror fans looking for a blood-drenched Christmas film. I'll firmly point you in the direction of Terrifier 3 for that. It should scratch the itch for those looking for some light-hearted horror that's in the spirit of the season. Thanks so much for watching this video, everyone. Having had the privilege to grow up with this film during the 80s, I'd be fascinated to hear how you guys were first introduced to the world of Gizmo and his scaly rivals, so feel free to leave me a comment. And while you're down there, if you want to like, share and subscribe so I can sit back and watch my league of followers multiply, that'd be awesome. I will be back soon with a new video, but until then, be good to yourselves and each other. I'll see you.